Patterson.
Chair, can I just confirm before I start for time management purposes, I've got a block of questions of 10 to 15 minutes. I realise we're about to go to a break.
We're about to go to a break.
Will I be able to be in continuation after the break, or should we go to the break early and I'll just start fresh? I'm in your hands.
Why don't we go to the break at 5 past and come back at 9:15?
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Let's do that.
Acting Commissioner, thank you for the update you provided about Operation Advana in your opening statement. It is good to see some progress has been made on these issues. Just a couple of quick factual matters to clarify. You mentioned that there's 14 individuals who are being investigated, the 3 search warrants, etc. How many people have been charged under the hate symbols provisions in the last year?
Senator, I can answer that question. No individuals have yet been charged under that legislation.
No. Okay. When was Operation Advana established?
I don't have the exact date, but I can find that out for you. It was shortly after the protest activity on, I think it was the 29th of September. So it was shortly after that.
Yeah, I've got a media release here which is dated the 3rd of October. Does that sound right to you?
That would sound roughly right, but I'll get confirmation for you, Senator.
And what was the date in which police issued that joint statement advising protesters about importance of compliance with the law and risks of breaching the law on hate symbols, etc.?
Again, I'd have to, I can get that date for you while we're still in here.
I think it was the 4th of October. My question is, given what we've seen on the streets of our cities in the last 12 months since the 7th of October, why hadn't the AFP issued a statement like this with your state police counterparts or established Operation Advana 12 months earlier?
So as you would be aware, the legislation came into place in January.
Fair enough. Let's say 10 months earlier then.
Sure. So there was a lot of work done initially, even prior to the legislation coming into place, which I think you have previously asked questions in relation to the work that we have done with the states and territories around ensuring that our police officers have got good awareness of the legislation and how it operates. So there's certainly been a lot of work done with our state and territory colleagues.
Sure.
Also through our community liaison
Not really getting to my
teams.
question about the establishment of the operation or the issuing of that joint police statement. I mean, was the 29th of September when the first possible breaches of the law occurred?
No. So I can confirm that we actually had our first allegation in relation to these offences on the 5th of January, I think, from memory, which was even a couple of days before the legislation came into effect. So the numbers that the Acting Commissioner has referred to in his opening statement are specific to that one protest on the 29th of September. We've received a total of 113 reports of crime between 8th of January and the end of October relating to prohibited hate symbols.
And how many individuals were investigated under those complaints?
So I can say that 49 have been subject to further investigations by the Joint Counter-Terrorism teams, and at the moment we've got 28 that remain active.
How many warrants have been executed under those complaints?
I'm sorry, I don't have that information available, but I can take that on notice.
Okay. On the 29th of September, the AFP issued a statement, which I'll quote in part. It's an offence to publicly display or trade a prohibited symbol where specific thresholds are met. The mere public display on its own does not meet the threshold of a Commonwealth offence, and you go on to, in the statement, the AFP goes on to explain what would be required to meet that. The very clear implication that media took from that statement was that the AFP did not believe that there are any breaches of the law on the 29th of September and would not be investigating them. Who authorised that statement to be released?
I would have to provide that to you either on notice or before the end of the hearing.
Thank you.
I don't have that answer.
And who drafted the statement?
Again, I'd have to provide that to you.
Thank you. Prior to this statement being issued, had the AFP already conducted any investigations into potential breaches of the law on that day?
On that day, sorry,
Yes.
do you mean from that protest
Correct.
activity?
Yes.
Sorry, can you ask the question again? Had we...
Prior to issuing this statement, which downplayed the likelihood of the law being breached, had the AFP conducted any investigations of a breach of the law at those rallies?
You're talking about quite a small window of time,
I know.
so I would have to take on notice in terms of the sequencing.
That's precisely the point.
Yes.
How could you issue a statement downplaying the possibility of criminal charges so quickly after these rallies had occurred?
So, Senator, can I just clarify the intent of that initial statement? We were receiving a lot of media inquiries around the offences. The intent of the and about the legislation itself. So the intent of that first media statement was to provide some clarifying information around the actual legislation. We were getting a lot of inquiries along the lines of why hadn't we just arrested people on the spot, or why hadn't we done particular things. So the purpose of the first statement was to provide some clarifying context in relation to the legislation, and then throughout the day and over the days after that, we continued to provide updates as we commenced investigations or conducted investigations.
Yes, but the subsequent updates were completely different in tone and nature. The subsequent updates made it clear the AFP was concerned about what happened on Sunday and was investigating, and it followed a pretty serious political outcry from the Prime Minister to the Premier to other political leaders saying this is a problem and it shouldn't have occurred. So what changed between the statement on the 29th and the statements that started from the 30th and then proceeded after that seemed to be completely different in the approach?
So, Senator, nothing changed. As I said, the intent of that first media statement was to provide some context around the legislation. I hope from the statistics that I've provided in relation to how many other investigations we had on foot and we continue to have on foot around those particular offences, that it does demonstrate that, of course, we take these offences seriously.
Sure, but it took a year before the AFP started to say that you were investigating these, that you were taking it seriously, that people could be charged and investigated. And yet there have been protests like that protest, not exactly the same in size, but in a similar nature, every weekend in our major cities since the 7th of October. And as you say, from mid-January onwards, they were covered by the hate symbols legislation. I mean, in Senate estimates in July, I tabled to you dozens of examples of people wearing the logos and symbols of terrorist organisations. Why did it take a year before the AFP suddenly changed its approach to take this much more seriously?
So, Senator, we didn't change our approach, as I've already mentioned.
Sorry to interrupt, Ms Barrett, but I'm limited for time. You did change your approach in two material respects. You established Operation Advana. That was a change in approach. And you issued a national statement with all other police agencies saying you took this very seriously and you investigated it. That's a change in approach.
So, Senator, what I would say is, as I've already mentioned, we've had many ongoing investigations in relation to these offences, some of which have come from those previous examples that you referred to back in July. So we've taken this seriously since the legislation came into effect. So there's not been a change of approach. I think, as I said, we were getting a lot of questions from the media, not completely understanding how the legislation works. So the purpose of that first statement was to try and provide that additional context.
Sure.
And then the subsequent updates were to say that, we had stood up the task force very specific to that protest activity because of the volume of referrals that were coming out of it. But
as I've said to you, and as you've told me, you'd received hundreds of referrals prior to that protest. You did not establish a special task force or operation in response to those referrals or other concerns about it, not just raised by me, but other members of Parliament across the political spectrum in a range of forums. So I welcome what appears to be a significant change of approach from the AFP, but I don't understand why you didn't move more quickly and respond earlier, because it might have prevented some of this from happening had you done so.
So what I would say to that, and you would be well aware, our joint counter-terrorism teams are very capable of investigating these types of matters. The reason we established Operation Advana for this particular protest activity goes to, I guess, the volume of the footage, for instance, that the Acting Commissioner spoke about in the opening statement, the amount of referrals that we received from that very specific protest, hence why we created that specific operation for that protest. But there have been many other investigations and some that are still on foot outside of that particular protest that we continue to progress.
Thanks, Senator.
Okay,
Senator Patterson, we'll leave it there and we'll go on our break.
I can also clarify for you, Senator, the media release for the one you're referring to, the first one on 30th of September, was cleared by Assistant Commissioner Stephen Nutt, who is Assistant Commissioner Counter-Terrorism Special Investigations.
Thank you.
Thanks. We'll suspend and come back at 9:15. Back to you for a short bracket and then we'll head to Senator Pocock after that.
Thank you, Chair. Deputy Commissioner, continuing where we left off, in that original statement and in some media interviews that you yourself have conducted post these events, the AFP's implied that there are some obstacles in charging people under this legislation, that it's not straightforward. Can you just briefly summarise what you see those obstacles are that is not straightforward to charge people for these display offences?
Sure. Thank you, Senator. So I'll just bear with me and I'll run through the elements. So the hate symbol, prohibited symbol, has to be intentionally displayed in a public place.
Yep.
The person has to know or have known that it was a symbol used to identify a prohibited terrorist organisation.
Yep.
And I think you'll be familiar with the legislation that, whilst it specifies to symbols related to Nazis,
Yes.
it doesn't specify specifically terrorist organisation symbols. So there would be obviously elements we would need to prove to show that it is a symbol that is related to a terrorist organisation.
Yes.
And then there are a number of elements around the display of the symbol has to involve the dissemination of ideas based on racial superiority or racial hatred, could incite another person or group.
Just kind of skipping through this very quickly, I just want to make clear on these subsections. So subsection 3, 4 or 7 applies. So not all of them need to apply, just one of them needs to apply,
Yes.
right? So
Yes, correct.
as you were saying, it could involve the dissemination of ideas based on racial superiority or racial hatred, and that would meet the test. Or, as you're going on to say, it could incite
Correct.
or...
Yes, yeah, that's correct.
Or it could be likely to offend, insult or humiliate a person. So any one of those tests would qualify. So all we have to prove is that it was done in a public place. So tick, that's very straightforward. This is done in a public place. Secondly, that the person knows it's a prohibited terrorist organisation. I'll defer to you on whether you can prove someone's intent. That's your expertise, not mine. But these were certainly terrorist symbols, right? In dozens of instances of terrorist symbols. I don't think that's in dispute. And then you only then have to prove that it's based on an idea of racial superiority or hatred, that it could incite someone or it could offend, insult and humiliate. I think the offend, insult and humiliate would be the easiest test to meet. I would probably have 200 emails from members of the Jewish community who described the terror that they felt, let alone the offence or the insult or the humiliation that they felt from the public display of these symbols. Would you disagree with that?
No, I wouldn't disagree.
Okay, so that doesn't seem like a huge obstacle. Let's go back to the others involving dissemination of ideas based on racial superiority or racial hatred. In the case of Hamas or Hezbollah, do you think that's hard to prove?
Senator, what I would say is that each one of these needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis, and that goes to the volume of the work that Advana is doing in relation to the specific protests that we're talking about, and then outside of that, the other investigations that we still have on foot. There's a lot that needs to go to proving these offences or getting them to a point where we can...
I appreciate the collection of evidence is significant
Yes.
and important responsibility, but in those interviews and in those statements, the AFP's pointed to the standards that you have to meet in the legislation, these barriers. So I want to understand if you think it is a difficult bar to meet to prove that someone displaying a Hamas logo or a Hezbollah logo involves dissemination of ideas based on racial superiority or racial hatred, yes or no?
Senator, it's really difficult for me to answer. As I said, it's about the context and it's about the environment, the setting, case by case.
Where in the legislation does it say the context is relevant?
Well, you're going to a reasonable person test in relation to what impact the display of the symbol is having.
No, that's only for subsection 7. There's no reasonable person. Oh, sorry, no, sorry, I correct myself. There is a reasonable person test in relation to subsection 3A.
Yep.
So let's go to that then. What would be required to demonstrate that a reasonable person thinks displaying a Hamas logo involves the dissemination of ideas based on racial superiority or racial hatred?
Senator, it's hard for me to hypothesise, and I'm not going to talk about active investigations.
No, I'm not asking you to.
Yes, so it's really difficult for me to answer that question.
Let me just assist in a way that might be helpful. If you go to the Hamas Charter, it's pretty clear. I'll quote just one section of it, but there are dozens like this. Quote, "The day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight Jews and kill them. Then the Jews will hide behind rocks and trees, and the rocks and trees will cry out, 'O Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him.'" Do you think that constitutes dissemination of ideas based on racial superiority or racial hatred?
Senator, what I might do is pass to Assistant Commissioner Stephen Nutt, who has been running Operation Advana, who can talk in a bit more detail around these offences.
Once we get this answer, we'll rotate the call. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. So, as Deputy Commissioner's already, Stephen Nutt, the Assistant Commissioner for Counter-Terrorism and Special Investigations. I know, Senator, in the outline of what needs to be proved in these offences, there were some areas that were skipped. Obviously, the intent, so what the person knew at the time of the public display, is a critical element.
Yeah, we talked about that.
To prove, yes. So if you look sequentially, we would have to prove those in that manner. Yes, you're right in terms of whether a reasonable person found the display by that person to involve racial hatred and superiority. We've covered that, but also to incite others to offend, insult, hatred
that's
of a person
an or.
based
There
on
is
race.
an or at
Senator
the end of that
Patterson,
sentence.
this is not an invitation for you to interrupt. You don't have the call. Mr Nutt, finish your answer and then I'm rotating the call.
Yep, and then of course we mentioned the other subsection that involves advocacy of hate. That's where you were talking about now. And of course it's not only advocacy around hate directed at a group of people distinguished by race, religion, nationality, but also constitutes incitement of another person or group to offend, insult, humiliate, intimidate, or to use force or violence against a targeted group. So yes, and then like you said in the other subsection, and they're not and, they're or, it's likely to offend, insult, humiliate, intimidate a reasonable person from the group, if you will, or member of group that's distinguished by race or other attributes.
Thank you, Chair. We might need Assistant Commissioner Nutt back, please, to continue this line of questioning. So, as we were discussing before the call was transferred, there's those initial elements that need to be proved. It's publicly displayed. The person knows that they're displaying a prohibited terrorist organisation symbol, and then only one of the following things needs to be proved: that it involves the dissemination of ideas based on racial superiority or racial hatred, or it could incite another person, or it involves advocacy of hatred of a group or persons distinguished by their race or religion, or constitutes incitement, or is likely to offend, insult, humiliate, etc. So each of those elements don't have to be proved together. Only one of those elements has to be proved. That's right, isn't it?
That's correct, Senator. In addition to proving that there wasn't a legitimate purpose and, of course, the exemptions that sit under the legislation.
Indeed. So earlier we were discussing whether or not having a Hamas flag involves the dissemination of ideas based on racial superiority or racial hatred, and I read a section from the Hamas Charter. But to take a different example, let's go to 4A, that advocacy of hatred is towards a group of persons distinguished by race, religion or nationality. Do you think there would be any challenge proving that in relation to a Hamas or Hezbollah logo or symbol?
Well, in the circumstances, it will be something that has to be proved.
Of course.
And, of course, that a reasonable person would view that the context of the public display, in addition to the knowledge elements that we've already and intent elements that we've already displayed, that a reasonable person in the circumstances would find that that advocates, as you said, hate. And so that goes into the possible meaning of the prohibited symbol that is on display and subject to the investigation. Yes.
So I can't see the words context or in the circumstances. That's not in the legislation. Is that an interpretation issue?
Well, they're legislative thresholds which describe circumstances, so that's just operationalising the legislation from a police perspective.
Okay, you're inserting language that's not on the face of the legislation, so I'm just trying to understand where you say it has to be in the context of the situation. Where do you read that from?
Well, that's in terms of the collection of appropriate evidence that meets the strict wording that is outlined in the legislation.
Okay, so to assist further, I've read out a section of Hamas Charter before, and bearing in mind the requirement in 4AI is to prove advocacy of hatred of a group of persons distinguished by race, religion or nationality. In the open letter that announced the formation of Hezbollah in 1988, they said, and I quote, "Our primary assumption in our fight against Israel states that the Zionist entity is aggressive from its inception and built on lands wrested from their owners at the expense of the rights of the Muslim people. Therefore, our struggle will only end when this entity is obliterated. We recognise no treaty with it, no ceasefire and no peace agreements, whether separate or consolidated." And it goes on in that vein. That seems to me to be involved in the advocacy of hatred of a person based on their nationality. Would you agree?
What I'd agree that obviously in that circumstance, Hamas, yes, is a prescribed terrorist organisation.
This was Hezbollah, but...
Sorry, I beg your pardon, Hezbollah, correct there, Hezbollah. Again, the knowledge, so that's quite specific knowledge, but is that in the knowledge of a reasonable person from a group who is essentially the target of the offence?
Yes,
or
I guarantee you.
Yes, so that would be, again, something that we would have to prove.
I guarantee you, even the most averagely informed member of the Jewish community knows what's in the Hamas Charter and what's in the Hezbollah Charter, knows what the intent of Hamas and Hezbollah is, and if there was any doubt in their minds about that, that's been removed in the last 12 months since the 7th of October.
Again, still something we'd have to prove, whether that's by expert evidence or whatever. But
I could provide you with some
that's
volunteers. I literally have hundreds of emails of people who...
It's a legal test of reasonable person. It's not an actual person, actually, Senator. So,
yeah, I think you know the point I'm making, right?
Yes, I do, Senator, and that's something that we would look to prove where we're investigating one of these offences.
Yeah, and the point I'm trying to make is I don't see why it would be so difficult to prove this, whereas what we've had from the AFP over a period of time is this law is really hard to enforce. That's the distinct impression you've left me and others with.
There's a number of steps that need to be proved to make out the offence. Obviously, we're investigating these matters in earnest, Senator, and where we reach the thresholds to charge, we will be making those referrals to the CDP or making those charge decisions.
Okay. Another provision of the Act, which we've discussed before in, I think, the July Senate estimates, was 82E, which ensures that something that so nearly resembles a symbol to which paragraph A applies, that it is likely to be confused with or mistaken for that symbol, is captured under the definition of a prohibited terrorist symbol. So it's not a defence to subtly modify the logo and display it in a way.
A logo used to identify terrorist organisations.
Correct, and I gave you some examples where the Arabic writing on the Al-Qassam Brigade's headband had been changed from the words associated with the Al-Qassam Brigades to "I like chocolate milk," but to someone who doesn't read Arabic, it looks no different from the ones that were on display the week before.
I understand.
Has this provision been used in any of the investigations so far?
No, but we're alive to it as a consideration because obviously there's been our matters include a number of public display of symbols, so it's always something we consider, whether it's something designed to try and divert or sidestep the legislation, so aware of it. It is a consideration.
To give you one concrete example, Al Yazbek, the man who's been charged with displaying a Nazi symbol publicly, at the same rally that he did that was also pictured with a modified Hezbollah flag that had a bushranger holding up a rifle instead of someone wearing a keffiyeh holding up a rifle. Pretty subtle variation. I think the intent was pretty clear. Is he being investigated for that, or are any other people who were holding that same flag at that same rally being investigated for that?
In that case, the AFP is not investigating that matter. I'm aware of the dare I say, Ned Kelly version, colours and all, and there was a public explanation on the intent behind the flag bearer on that occasion. And when we look at the intent of the individual and seriously whether it is a symbol that is used to identify a prescribed terrorist organisation, that would have to be taken into account to investigate that matter further.
Are the things that people say and do while they're displaying these logos a relevant consideration? For example, some people were engaging in pretty inflammatory public statements while waving these symbols.
Absolutely, Senator. In terms of determining those legislative thresholds that I was referring to before, and I keep referencing to context, that sort of conduct of the individual who was displaying prohibited symbols absolutely taken into account.
Does that include the people who held up aloft photos of Hassan Nasrallah and Yahya Sinwar after they were killed, pledging their allegiance to those terrorist leaders and their cause?
Again, all the context, and we said case by case, is taken into account as to whether we meet the thresholds and whether there are those circumstances as outlined against race, advocate and offence, let's say loosely.
I imagine devoting your life to a slain terrorist leader could also engage other Commonwealth Code violations, including associating and supporting a terrorist organisation. Is anyone being investigated for that?
We do investigate such public displays or even potential praising, as you know, is captured under the definition of advocating in advocating terrorism in the Criminal Code Act. We would look at those circumstances. As you know, the legislation does spell out very specific situations.
And I'm asking for a kind of specific answer rather than a general one. Is anyone being investigated for that? Because we know that there are people being investigated under 82HA. What about this?
Correct, Senator. We do have investigations against the advocating provisions. However, I won't step into describing those any further because that's too much operational detail.
Okay. What about the federal prohibition on using a carriage service to menace or harass? Has anyone been investigated in the context of these rallies and events and the Israel-Gaza issues more broadly for that offence?
The 474 offences, is that what you're referring to?
I don't know what the provision of the criminal code is, but it's an offence to menace and harass using a carriage service.
Yes, that's right, Senator. And in the circumstances...
For example, online harassment, right? People who've been harassed online, threatened online, that's a carriage service. The internet is defined as a carriage service.
Yes, Senator.
Is anyone being investigated for those breaches?
I don't have personal knowledge. These matters can be investigated not only by the AFP but also by state and territory police. Individuals who feel threatened or harassed in those circumstances can report the matter to the local police station and they could well be under investigation. We don't have sight on what investigations are on foot by other agencies.
Okay. Just finally, has Section 82K of the legislation been utilised yet? To help you out, that's the provision that a state or territory police officer or an AFP member has the power to direct a person, verbally or in writing, to remove a prohibited symbol from public display within a reasonable timeframe. Failure to comply with the direction is an offence under 82M with a maximum penalty of 20 penalty units or about $6,000. Has that power been used?
It's available and we understand it has been used by some of our state and territory colleagues in their engagement with individuals at a protest. Obviously, if there's compliance in those circumstances, no further issue. It's obviously an offence to breach or fail to comply with that takedown request.
Okay. Our conversation about these issues, has anyone been investigated under Section 82JA, which is the trading provisions? I
can take that one, Senator. And yes, there is an investigation underway against those provisions, yes. Yep.
And are there any obstacles you're concerned about enforcing those provisions of the legislation?
I wouldn't describe them as obstacles, Senator. Obviously, the provisions are quite detailed in how trading is to occur. There's obviously definitions similar to, knowledge requirements similar to the other provisions under the prohibited hate symbols. There is an expansive section which you may be aware of around the jurisdictional requirements around how the trading actually occurs.
Yeah.
And again, in the interest of time, I won't go into those, but I can if you want me to.
No. I mean, those are the kind of understandable constitutional reasons, right? The Commonwealth can't just prevent trade everywhere in Australia. So that's why I was referring to obstacles in that instance. And just one point of clarification, the intention provision that you're required to prove, that the legislation reads, person knows that the thing is a prohibited terrorist organisation signal.
Correct.
Do they simply need to know it is a symbol of a terrorist organisation, or do they also need to understand that terrorist organisation is prescribed or prohibited or listed in Australia?
It's an excellent question, Senator. It is pretty nuanced. It has to be. We need to prove that they knew that it was a symbol used to identify. No, so it's not just used. It's actually a symbol to identify a prescribed terrorist organisation, as well as that the organisation is a prescribed terrorist organisation.
Right.
And that's distinct to the Nazi symbols, which is obviously different.
Yes, I understand the Nazi symbols are more straightforward. So, I mean, I think it would be disingenuous for someone who knows enough about Hamas to fly their flags to not know that they're banned in Australia. And police and political leaders and everyone has been saying for months these are prescribed terrorist organisations, these are listed terrorist organisations.
I would say, Senator, that the coverage and engagement not only by community liaison teams, but also police of jurisdiction with protest organisers around this legislation has had an effect, and we can see that on the streets.
Well, I was going to observe the same thing. I think, for whatever reason, something really shifted in the community after the 29th of September. This had been going on week in, week out, without much deterrent effect. But after the 29th of September and after the actions the AFP took, putting out that joint statement, establishing Operation Advana, you can now see at these rallies it is materially different. There are still a few people skirting the law and playing games with the law, but by and large the terrorist symbols are much less commonly identified at these rallies than they were. That, I think, is consistent with the Parliament's intent. We're perfectly happy for people to protest. We just don't want them to glorify or praise terrorist organisations in the protests or terrorise, persecuted communities. So, I mean, this seems to me to be the tragedy of this whole thing. Had the AFP taken the action it did after the 29th of September, 8 or 9 months earlier, we could have had far less transgressions of the law and far fewer displays of terrorist organisation symbols throughout this whole year, and therefore far less trauma for the affected communities. I might direct this to you, Mr McCartney. Is there any reflection in the AFP about the failure to be more proactive earlier and get ahead of this and deter people from doing this?
I think, as Deputy Commissioner Barrett stated, we were proactive. We were proactive through the JCTTs, but just given the circumstances with the volume of material, the AFP made the decision to stand up the standing task force. But I note your comments. But I think, and I think it's fair to say, as you would be aware, Senator, we put some of our best detectives or investigators into the JCTTs because of the priority that those matters hold to the issue of national security. So I think it's an issue of we were proactive, but obviously I note your comments in relation to the standing task force.
Sure, but I mean, there were a lot of early warnings throughout this process from me and other members of Parliament, including across the political spectrum in this forum and in other forums, directly given that feedback, and we weren't the only ones to do so. It really escalated on the 29th of September. That was a shocking thing for most Australians, and people much more senior than me or my colleagues, including the Prime Minister and Premiers of our states, spoke out. And that seemed to me to produce a different response from AFP and your state counterparts, to be fair, not just the AFP. And that has changed the way these rallies are being conducted in a positive way. So do you really can't acknowledge or concede that an approach like that earlier could not have helped avoid some of this?
Senator, what I would say to that is, ordinarily we don't proactively put out media releases around investigations that we're undertaking unless we get a specific media inquiry or there's something that prompts us to put out a media release. So I guess that goes back to the fact that we had quite a number of investigations already on foot. I also referred earlier that we had been talking with our states and territories for well and truly a number of months, and also we'd been talking about putting out that joint statement. As the Acting Commissioner said, and as I've said tonight, the volume that came from that protest on the 29th of September caused us to stand up the specific operation. But the JCTTs had been working on those matters or similar matters since the beginning of the year.
Yeah, look, I'm not saying you weren't doing anything. I'm just saying you started to do a lot more after this turning point, and it's produced a positive effect. And I think even if you're not willing to concede it in this forum or to me, I hope within the AFP you're reflecting on your role in helping to prevent crime like this from happening in the future by taking a strong stand earlier that sends a strong message to the community that it won't be tolerated, that there'll be consequences. I mean, look at what's happened to Al Yazbek. He's been charged with this serious crime. It's had serious ramifications for him personally and professionally. I guarantee he will not be turning up to any rallies again with a Nazi symbol. I don't think anyone else is going to do it who's seen what happened to him. This is the power of enforcing the law, right? You know this better than anyone. This is your job. But surely there's some reflection on that. If you don't want to comment, I understand, but... Okay. Just one final clarification then. Just on this question of the state of knowledge required about the terrorist organisation and the symbol. The EM on the bill says paragraph 82E3A provides that for the purpose of the definition of prohibited terrorist organisation symbol, terrorist organisation has the meaning given to that term in Division 102 of the Criminal Code. This includes listed terrorist organisations and organisations which are directly or indirectly engaged in preparing, planning and assisting in or fostering the doing of a terrorist act. So it seemed to me, based on the EM, that it is not only terrorist organisations that are explicitly listed by the Commonwealth, but also other terrorist organisations involved in terrorism.
That's correct, Senator. And in practical terms, you've got the prescribed terrorist organisations, and then you've got collections behaving like terrorist organisations, and that's proved through conduct, and it's proven in the court. And therefore, when a threshold is met as that they've acted in a way of a prescribed terrorist organisations, everything flows from that.
Right, and
Thanks,
so that...
Senator Patterson, we have to hand over the call.
Okay,
Thank you very
Chair.